Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about small changes. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, can you share your experiences of a situation in which a small change in a requirement resulted in many changes all over the system? Yes, I can, and I actually have more than one. I'm going to give you the cheesy one first because I still kind of I think about that sometimes, but I'll also give you one that is a little bit more meaningful that hopefully has a lesson or two in it. So the cheesy one was that I was working at a company and the CTO at that specific company was a bit of a code evangelist. He had his quirks and so forth. And one of the things that was important to him was naming and clear language. Let's call it clear language in the software that we were writing. And so, as you can imagine, guys, when you start a IT company or you run a company for long enough, certain things change over the course of the life of the company. So something that you called, say, a classic one is you have a naming convention for something, or you have a department that exists that has a certain name or so forth. And as we software developers will do, due to know us trying to make the software match the language, ideally at the very least, to the business, well, we will name the code and the variables and the classes and all of that good stuff in accordance with what is actually in the company at that time. And so when the company changes, well, then the names no longer really have a connection right in the code. And so that happened, and he said that he wanted us to change because the project had changed fundamentally, like the naming convention had changed just because we were telling customers about these sorts of things, right? And we wanted to have a new term for a certain thing. And so he said, we're going to update that in the code. And as you can imagine, if you're going to change one of the most core names that you have within the organization and make it something else, changing that in code is pretty significant. It's really significant actually because the case was for us that it's not just we were lucky we were doing this in a typed language, so at least we could be safe there. I mean, that would be really scary if you did it in something like an untyped language or a scripting language like say JavaScript or so forth, because when you change a name and it has semantic meaning for how the like or rather it affects how the code is going to operate, well then you might introduce a bug. And we had hundreds of thousands of lines of code that he wanted to basically sit and just rename things in order to fix. And then, of course, there are configuration values that are in different config files, and we were using cloud services and stuff like that. So, like, the work was enormous if we wanted to do this. And I tried to pitch the idea that maybe we do the thing that we did with keyboards, or, how certain industries have basically standardize on something that now is not 100% correct or like the optimal thing, and then we simply agree on that the cost of changing that thing is simply too high with too little benefit. So it's easier for us to just remember that the keyboard layout is not perfect, like it could have been better or something like that, or the name we use for something may not be 100% accurate, but the cost of changing it is just too high. Because as I was making the argument, he wasn't really buying it, but I still made it. Well, we know what words to use when we talk to the customers because the name change was just for the customer. And because we know that in the code that is it means the same thing to us semantically in the software. It's just that we use another name when we talk to the customer. Surely, I hope at the very least most of our software developers will be able to sort of handle that. It did not sit really all that well, and I think that had more to do with him than that this was an unreasonable idea. If we take something that is a little less cheesy, then yeah, you change the name of basically the project, and yeah, that is going to change a lot of code. I had a project that I became the product manager for. I was also working as a software developer at the same time within within that specific team. And so the thing that I was responsible for was basically a content management system, which just dealt with a lot of different resources like translations of text and things like that, and images and so forth and so forth. And the choice that one of the previous developers had made was for the UI in this case. So as you can imagine, a content management system is basically just create a resource that points to a bunch of translations of text and stuff like that, and then you have various languages and images and stuff like that. And so what they had done was that they had created something very similar to a file explorer, where they had a navigation bar on the side which basically just listed all the resources that you had in the system. So every single thing that you had created, like if you only had one resource, there was one item there. If you had 10, there was 10, and so forth. Now, the way that they had structured this was that it looked exactly as a file explorer, but the way that they stored the information in the database was, as you can imagine, it was a relational database, so it was a table. Now, that may not seem all that significant, but what happened was that when we wanted to implement things like, because they had started adding, drop downs that you could group things with and stuff like that. As for those of you who have never really thought about it, when you deal with a file explorer and that where you can nest things in folders and things like that, what you actually need is a graph. Or a tree, basically, that is a tree. And if you store all the information as a table, where in their case they use something they called namespaces to do the semantic grouping, that creates a lot of problems. Because the problem is that you can have the same name of a file or a resource in a folder. You can't have exactly the same name at the same level, but you can have multiple layers of the same thing. And because they hadn't really thought about it, like what type of data structure they needed in order to represent basically a file system, I can't even imagine how much problems we had. Like we had to, like several times I found that I can't accurately target the things that we want to delete, because if there are folders that have, or like if there are parts of the folder structure that have files that have the same naming conventions and so forth, we have to restructure the source code, or like the actual data structure, so that it has some way of identifying the whole path down to that file. Basically, we have to create a bunch of paths in a flat file system. And then the next problem comes, which is, okay, so now what happens if you have a lot of resources? I think that one of the bigger teams had over 2,000 resources in a file navigator. Well, they had really not thought about this. So if you have over 2,000 resources, we had to implement very, as you can imagine, really weird stuff. Like it became the case, like, because I'd explained to them, if you want this to work well, because we can't, like, the page is never going to load with 2,000 resources like that. So we're gonna have to implement something like progressive scrolling or pagination on a file, like a file explorer, which is, it doesn't even make sense, right? Have you ever seen pagination on a file explorer? Well, no, you haven't really. I haven't at the very least. And because this is a web application, even if we were to say that, okay, we're not going to do that, we're just going to list the top 2,000 things and then we're not going to load anything beneath it, well, then the next thing is, okay, so how do you load the subsequent resources? Because you can't load all of it at the same time. That creates a performance issue. So now if they open a folder, we have to make a query, and then you have a loader for every time you want to open a file or like open a folder within that file structure. Safe to say, the thing I told them was very simply that let's just do the thing that most content management systems, and not just content management systems, like what most resource management systems do in this sort of situation. They create a table for all the resources, and they implement pagination, or at least a list or something like that, instead of having the file explorer. So what I want you to take away from this is that, yes, I have definitely seen situations where small changes are they almost seem arbitrary decisions have had large and far-reaching consequences for the software that the team writes. And honestly, it's a bit of a skill to really see those sorts of situations. I argue that is like the true talent of someone who does really good with software design and things like that, is to do that, to understand, to see far enough ahead and know, you know, how developers usually work and how companies usually work and so forth, to sort of spot what I call backbone features or backbone decisions, call it whatever you want. Those sorts of decisions within the company or the code that will by themselves, if you're an inexperienced software developer, not mean much to you. It's just an arbitrary, it's just another story, right? But if you really know the impact that has, you will know that that is something that will affect other work. Classic example is, what type of database do you pick, or similar sort of, or what programming language do you pick? Like, those are very obvious things. But as you can imagine, if you pick the wrong database or the wrong programming language or framework or things like that, like the wrong toolset, it might be really tricky for you to ship any software. You might have tons of problems if you pick the wrong framework or so forth and so forth. And those decisions are all over the place, guys. In my situation, a simple thing like changing the name of the company or like some terms within the company is a significant investment, because the term is used in so much code that if we wanted to keep it absolutely up to date, it would mean weeks of work. And I even said so. And I also said that, do you really want to spend weeks of work to just sit and rename stuff and then regression check everything? Yeah, I'm not so sure about that one. But try to think a little bit, guys, about the decisions that you are making, because sometimes, like a lot of the times, small arbitrary decisions, they are there and you don't really have to overthink it. But sometimes you have things that will affect and cascade. And the easiest way to spot those sorts of situations is when you think about, what would we have to change in the code to make this work really, really well? And what will we not be able to do if we make this decision? Have a great day.